It was February of 1997, and Patrick McNeill was 21 years old. He was a student at Fordham University, the kind of kid whose life looked like it was already going somewhere. Good grades, athletic, the type of person people described afterward in the same handful of words. Friendly, well-liked, going places. That night he was out with friends at a bar called the Dapper Dog on Manhattan's Upper East Side. He'd had a lot to drink. At some point he got sick in the bathroom, and at some point after that, he walked outside, alone, to wait for a ride home. He never made it. For weeks, there was nothing. No sightings, no leads, no body. And then, almost 2 months later, a group of workers found him in the East River, nearly 12 miles from the bar where he was last seen alive. The official finding was straightforward: accidental drowning, alcohol intoxication. A young man, drunk, disoriented, near water at night. It happens. It's tragic, but it's not mysterious. At least, that's how the case was closed on paper. One of the detectives who worked that case never accepted it. His name was Kevin Gannon, and something about the file didn't sit right with him. It wasn't one dramatic piece of evidence, it was the geography. 12 miles is a long way for a body to travel by accident. It was the timeline. It was a feeling, the kind experienced investigators sometimes get, that the simple explanation didn't actually explain anything. He made a promise to McNeill's parents that he'd keep looking into it. He had no idea at the time that this promise would consume the next 2 decades of his life. Gannon eventually partnered with another retired NYPD detective, Anthony Duarte, and later a criminal justice professor from St. Cloud State University named Dr. Lee Gilbertson. Together they started doing something almost nobody else was doing: pulling old case files. Not new investigations, old ones, closed cases. Cases that had already been filed away as accidents, in cities the three of them had no jurisdiction in and no official reason to be looking at. And as they went through file after file, a pattern started to take shape. The victims were almost always young men, usually college age, usually white, usually athletic and well-liked. The kind of people friends and family described as having their whole lives ahead of them. They were almost always out drinking with friends the night they disappeared. And they almost always turned up dead in a body of water, a river, a lake, a canal, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks later, often a significant distance from where they were last seen. On the surface, none of that is especially strange. Young men go out drinking. Sometimes they wander near water at night, disoriented, and something terrible happens. Alcohol impairs judgment, slows reaction time, and makes cold water far more dangerous than people realize. It's one of the most well-documented risk factors for accidental drowning that exists. If you looked at any one of these cases in isolation, an investigator would have every reason to rule it an accident because in isolation, it looks exactly like one. But Gannon, Duarte, and Gilbertson weren't looking at these cases in isolation. They were looking at dozens of them, side by side, and the coincidences kept stacking up in a way that made them uncomfortable. Then came the detail that would define the entire case in the public imagination: graffiti. In at least a dozen of the cases they examined, the detectives claimed to find a spray-painted smiley face somewhere near the scene, near where the body was recovered, or near where the victim was last seen. Sometimes there were other symbols nearby too, ones the investigators have been cautious about publicizing, saying only that they've shared them with a small number of trusted law enforcement contacts. The theory that formed from all of this was almost hard to say out loud because of how large it was. Gannon and his colleagues came to believe that these weren't the work of a single killer, operating alone, the way most serial killer narratives go. They came to believe this was organized, a loosely connected network, operating in different cities, targeting a very specific type of victim, using a symbol as a kind of signature. Not a lone wolf. Something closer to a gang, if you believed the most extreme version of the theory, with cells of a dozen or so members in different parts of the country, drugging or overpowering victims outside bars, and staging the deaths to look like accidents. Gannon has said, in interviews over the years, that he believes over 1,000 people could be connected to this network in some way. That's an enormous claim, and the way he has tried to substantiate it is through the sheer number of cases he's compiled, a running database that has grown over more than 2 decades, from around 40 potential victims to more than 300. 300 names, 11 states, at minimum, mostly clustered around the Midwest and Northeast, near college towns and nightlife districts, always near water. One case that got significant attention was Chris Jenkins, a University of Minnesota student who was last seen being kicked out of a Minneapolis bar on Halloween night in 2002, reportedly for wearing a costume that violated the bar's dress code. He disappeared that night. His body was found in the Mississippi River months later. Investigators who support the theory point to this case as one of the clearer examples. A young man, matching the profile almost exactly, vanishing after a night out, turning up in water far from where he was last seen. The detectives also lean heavily on something more technical to make their case: decomposition. In several instances, they've argued that the condition of a recovered body simply didn't match how long that person had supposedly been missing. Bodies that had allegedly been in the water for weeks, they claim, showed a level of preservation that didn't add up, suggesting to them that the victim might have been held somewhere before being placed in the water, rather than drowning immediately on the night they disappeared. If true, that detail alone would be enough to overturn a ruling of accidental death. It would suggest captivity. It would suggest intent. It would suggest exactly the kind of organized violence the detectives believe is happening. But here's where the story gets more complicated, and where you have to hold two things in your head at once, because both sides of this argument are backed by real people with real credentials, not just internet speculation. In April of 2008, one day after Gannon, Duarte, and Gilbertson went public with their theory, the FBI issued a formal statement. They said they had reviewed the material provided by the two retired detectives. They said they had interviewed at least one individual connected to the case, and their conclusion was blunt. They had found no evidence linking these deaths to each other, and no evidence supporting the idea that any of them were the work of a serial killer or group of killers. Their assessment was that the vast majority of these cases were exactly what they appeared to be on paper: alcohol-related drownings. 2 years later, in 2010, a nonprofit called the Center for Homicide Research in Minneapolis went even further. They published a detailed report, 18 separate points, laid out methodically, arguing that the entire theory didn't hold up to scrutiny. Their findings challenged almost every pillar the detectives had built their case on. On the graffiti, researchers found that smiley face symbols are actually one of the most common graffiti tags in the country. Go looking in almost any 5-mile radius of any American city, and you'll likely find one somewhere, completely unrelated to any crime. When they compared the smiley faces found near different linked cases, they found the styles, sizes, and apparent ages of the paint varied significantly, inconsistent with a single artist, or even a coordinated group using a shared visual signature. And there was no defined standard for how close a piece of graffiti had to be to a scene to count as connected in the first place, which meant investigators had significant room to interpret ambiguous evidence in a way that supported the theory they already believed. Some individual police departments pushed back directly. The department in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which had handled 8 of the cases the detectives flagged as part of the pattern, stated publicly that they found no smiley face symbols connected to any of their investigations at all. On the decomposition claims, forensic experts have noted that decomposition rates in water are notoriously difficult to use as a precise clock. Water temperature, depth, current, and even what the body is wearing can all dramatically change how a body looks after a given amount of time submerged. What looks anomalous to a non-forensic investigator doesn't necessarily look anomalous to a medical examiner. And on the broader pattern, young athletic men, drinking, disappearing near water, skeptics point out that this isn't actually a rare demographic to lose people from. Young men are statistically more likely to drink heavily, more likely to be out late at night in unfamiliar areas, and more likely to end up near water in cities that are built along rivers and lakes, which describes most of the cities in question. When you're actively searching for a pattern across a specific set of characteristics, some experts argue, you'll find one, even if there's no underlying connection between the cases at all. It's less about deception and more about how easy it is to convince yourself you've found a signal in what's actually noise. Even people close to the original cases have expressed doubt. The reporter who first broke national coverage of the theory later said she'd grown skeptical over time. Some parents of victims who had initially supported the detectives' work, desperate, understandably, for any explanation other than, "Your son made a fatal mistake," later distanced themselves from the theory as well. So you have two groups of serious people looking at the same 300 cases and arriving at completely opposite conclusions. One side sees an unmistakable pattern hiding in plain sight, ignored for decades because no single police department has jurisdiction over cases spread across 11 states. The other side sees confirmation bias, a handful of surface-level similarities among a group of people who, statistically, were already at elevated risk of exactly the kind of accident being described, and in the middle of all that disagreement are the families. Because whatever the truth actually is, real people are dead. Real parents got a phone call no parent should ever get, and then got an official explanation that many of them, understandably, struggle to accept. It's a lot easier to live with the idea that your son was murdered by someone evil than to live with the idea that one bad night, one bad decision near a dark riverbank, ended everything. That doesn't mean the murder theory is true, but it helps explain why it has refused to die, even after 2 decades of pushback from the people whose job it is to investigate exactly this kind of thing. Gannon and Duarte haven't stopped. If anything, the case has defined the rest of their lives. Gannon has said publicly that he mortgaged his own house at one point to keep the investigation going. In 2014, the team put out a book laying out their findings. In 2019, the cable network Oxygen turned their work into a 6-part documentary series, bringing the theory to a much larger audience than it had ever reached before. And then something happened that nobody in 2008 could have predicted: TikTok. A theory that had spent a decade mostly confined to true crime forums and cable documentaries found an entirely new life on social media, where a younger generation of amateur investigators started picking apart old case files, sharing tips, building what some of them literally call teams, and treating decades-old drownings like an active, ongoing investigation. Some of these creators have claimed to work directly with Gannon himself, passing along license plate numbers and eyewitness accounts from strangers who reach out to them online, and the case list has kept growing. As recently as late 2025, a cluster of bodies recovered from bayous in Houston reignited the theory in national headlines. 16 bodies, pulled from the water in a single year, in the same general area. City officials publicly downplayed any connection, calling it a tragic but unconnected series of events. Gannon, predictably, disagreed, telling reporters he'd never seen drowning numbers like that before, especially concentrated in one location. Other experts in the field urged caution on both sides, arguing that a spike in numbers alone doesn't prove a connection, but that each case still deserved individual, careful investigation rather than a blanket dismissal. That tension, that refusal to fully resolve, is really the heart of this entire story. Almost 30 years after Patrick McNeill walked out of a bar in Manhattan and never came home, nobody has been arrested. Nobody has been named as a suspect. There's no confession, no forensic smoking gun, no single piece of evidence that definitively proves either side of this argument correct. What exists is a database of over 300 names, a small group of retired investigators who have dedicated their lives, and in Gannon's case, quite literally their homes, to proving a connection most of law enforcement has rejected. And on the other side, a well-documented, methodical case for why all of this might simply be the devastating, ordinary tragedy of young people, alcohol, and water, repeated hundreds of times across a quarter century. Both of those explanations are, in their own way, hard to sit with. One means there's an organized, active threat that has operated for decades without a single arrest. The other means hundreds of families have spent years searching for meaning in something that may have simply been an accident over and over again, with no larger explanation at all. Maybe that's the most unsettling part of this entire case. Not the smiley faces, not the decomposition timelines, not even the number 300. It's the fact that we may never actually know which explanation is true, and that the not knowing is exactly what's kept this story alive for almost 30 years, and counting. What do you think really happened? Let me know in the comments.